before heading on to our new stuff, anything about the stuff to be or the stuff that has been that needs more stuff? Okay, so last time we're beginning our adventures in Chapter 4, looking at credibility. And of course, credibility has always been important as a concept, but it's especially important today in an age of social media, fake news, and all of that stuff. Now, one of the main concerns we have with the media is, first, as mentioned last time, it's been heavily consolidated. So you have a very few companies controlling all of it. Then you bring in social media, pretty much in terms of information, Facebook is primarily the dominant source of people's news today. And of course, their main concern at Facebook, well, isn't the truth. Does Mark Zuckerberg go to his minions and say, make sure all the things out there are true? Is that the tagline of Facebook? Facebook, all the true stuff. No, I mean, they're in the business of making money. And of course, they got into a fair amount of trouble from what they were doing. But of course, it's hard to blame them. Well, I guess you can blame them, but if you're in business to make money, that's what you do. So you should be very cautious about what you hear, because again, the business of business is making money, and very few companies control the information. Secondly, the government, to a far lesser extent than the US, does manage the news, so we want to take that into account. And getting into our news stuff, now the media, of course, not infallible. Reporters, editorialists, etc. are people, and people make mistakes. And so you can have things that are, they make a mistake, the news comes out, there's incorrect information, they run with it too quickly. Now in some cases, it's a perfectly honest mistake, because the situation may be like changing dynamically, they may be being appropriately cautious, and say something from apparently a reputable source that turns out later to be incorrect, because people do make mistakes. And that, of course, is something to watch for, but it is forgivable, because if people are doing all they're supposed to do and things still go wrong, you might say, well, that was unfortunate, but it's really hard to blame them if they're doing everything they're supposed to do, because as they say, to err is human, for you to divine, and we all make mistakes. Now, where it becomes kind of problematic is where the media is too quick to run with a story. A good example just recently is the famous case where you had the students from a religious school wearing MAGA hats confronting Native Americans with another group off to the side. And of course the media quickly rushed to one narrative based on limited cracks. And then further investigation revealed it wasn't exactly as initially it seemed, as is often the case. And so in that case they were going with the information they had, but they were too quick about it. So one thing to watch for is if you get a story that's especially controversial, it's always wise to wait for the facts to come in before leaping to judgment. It may turn out, yes, it is as terrible as they say, or it may turn out that there are complications and nuances that make the situation somewhat different, sometimes even completely different. For example, there was a case some years ago of a woman who was giving a speech, and they ran like a portion of her speech that made her seem super racist, and she was fired. And then it turns out that part of her speech was condemning racism, not being super racist. And they're like, we're sorry, we probably should have looked at your whole speech. And so it's always good to be cautious. Because it may not be malice, it may just be being quick to get the story out there, to be the first to get all the clicks and the eyeballs. There are also cases where sort of the mistake is not really intentional, but based on too much zeal for like an agenda. One of the examples of this, which I would infer they teach in journalism classes, is the end of Dan Rather's career. Dan Rather used to be like a super famous journalist. He was kind of the protege of Walter Cronkite, who's super journalist in his day, super trusted, super dead now, of course. And Dan Rather went after George Bush. And there was this memo that claimed that George Bush had gotten like a special deferment to stay out of Vietnam. And he ran the memo without properly checking it. Turned out it was really sketchy, probably not true, and so that was it for Dan Rather. He was too eager to get that out there, and that was that. So the takeaway is, media can make mistakes, Today, there's a huge rush to get things out there quickly, to get clicks and eyeballs. And of course, people in journalism can have their own agendas. And so it's always good to be cautious, because there could be honest mistakes, there could be just rushing, too quickly, and there can be agendas to watch for. So the general takeaway is always be cautious. Speaking of agendas, as I mentioned back on Tuesday, going back to the time of Nixon and Spiro Agnew, and we're getting kind of a flashback to what I mentioned Roger Stone, who's in the news today, and he did the little Nixon thing, and he's got a Nixon face tattooed on his back, apparently for real. And Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, kind of started the idea of the liberal bias in the media. And of course that went to the Bush administration, both of them, and today it's evolved into not only the media is biased, but they're lying. Our president constantly tweets about a lying New York Times, fake news, etc. So it is a fair question with all these accusations, is the media biased? Now, one easy answer is, yeah. For example, is Fox News biased?
Yeah.
Yes, hard conservative. They are essentially like part of the Republican Party in a way. Now, their news is pretty good. The challenge, though, is separating out news from news-like editorial stuff. Similarly, MSNBC is biased left, although their news is can be pretty good. Other news stations, like for example NPR, often gets accused of being left biased, but generally they're pretty good with their shows. BBC also generally pretty good, although they probably have some unavoidable biases. Now, one problem is, going back to our notion of experts, there are experts, credible experts, who say, no, there's not a bias, and others who say, yes, there's a bias. So what's the correct answer? Well, the correct answer seems to be yes and no. Clearly MSNBC and Fox, clearly biased. More neutral ones like NPR, BBC, less so. So what do you do when you're looking at the news? Well, the thing to do is not immediately say, aha, it's from Fox, so it's got to be false, or MSNBC, so it's got to be false, but to look for signs of bias. Is the story being presented in a neutral manner, focusing on the facts, or are there like judgments talking about like how good or terrible it is, and you can kind of detect clear leaning. If there's clearly leaning, then it's fair to say that there is a bias going on, either positive or negative. If it seems to be a sort of a clear presentation of this is what occurred without trying to spin it either way, then probably less biased. Now, of course, everyone's got biases, otherwise someone would be have no values and no emotions, but the idea is to see if it's actually infecting the story. And so we want to carefully separate out, when people are letting their values, biases, etc. push the story, or when it's actually sort of neutrally being presented. So it's good to be cautious. Especially today, where the goal of the news, which has long been to make money. Cable news. Now, back in the ancient days, before time, there was about an hour of news on per day. Typically, like most places, you did at 6 o'clock the local news, talking about like local sports and probably some story about a cat in a tree or something. And then at 6:30, you'd have the national news on the affiliates. And if you really were into the news, you could watch PBS and get like an hour or a couple hours of news. And so not a lot of time to fill. Nowadays, of course, how long is the news on?
24 hours.
Yeah, 24 hours, thanks to
CNN.
CNN. They got it going. Got it right here. News. Now, if you got 24 hours to fill, you got to stuff a whole bunch of stuff in there. So one thing that happens is a lot of unimportant stuff gets pushed in there, and they kind of have to sell it. So they often pitch things as being far more dramatic and dangerous. And this often gets made fun of, in parodies about like, the 25 things in your kitchen that can kill you. News at 11. And the idea being that in order to get people to watch all this stuff, you got to over-dramatize it, which can make things, more scary than they really are. So one problem is you gotta fill up all that time. Another problem, of course, is there's a lot of competition. So you have to get people looking at the news. So they tend to be more sensational and tend to be more biased. I mean, the news has always been a business. You know, if anybody's in journalism, I hope they cover things like yellow journalism, the Spanish-American War, and the role of, biased journalism. But of course, you need to consider that today as well. So the general advice is this. Neutral stuff in the news, like reporting disasters and events, probably accurate. The more sort of politicized it gets, the more you should be, questioning it. So ideally what you would do if it was something important is you'd want to get multiple sources. So if you hear something, especially something that, really the more you like it in a way, the more you should check on it to see if it's actually true. And if what happened in the 2016 election is people would hear something they wanted to hear, like Hillary, is committing some terrible crimes or something terrible with Donald Trump, and they'd just rush to post it on Facebook and not look into it, not to see if it's actually true. So a very important thing to do is run it through those checks. Does this seem to match my own observations? Does this match my background information? And check the source. Where is this coming from? And then also checking it from other sources. So if you have multiple sources that are, sort of different political angles, and they're saying the same thing, not guaranteed to be true, but more likely. So if it's important, it's good to be cautious. Interestingly, despite the arrival of the interwebs, radio is still a thing. Of course, now radio is on the internet as well. Now, while the mainstream media is often accused of being liberal, talk radio tends to be much more conservative. Does anybody know some of like the famous talk radio folks?
I have the best example, like Rush LaBossiere.
Yeah, he's the guy. And is he lefty, liberal?
Hard right.
Yeah, hard right. And so he's, in a way, kind of honest about it. He's not there to, present the matters objectively. He's presenting with a clear agenda, using terms like, feminartsy and libtards and snowflakes, etc. Now, one way you can spot sort of bias is if someone's using derogatory terms. If they're throwing out terms like libtard and snowflake and feminazi, probably not neutral. Now, so talk radio, which is mostly dominated by the right, the left tried but failed terribly. I guess they stuck with Hollywood. You should, of course, be cautious. If someone has a clear agenda, they're generally going to present things slanted their way, and of course, they might even just simply make up stuff. For example, InfoWars, which I think is mostly on the web. Maybe he's got a broadcasting thing, and often those literally make stuff up, or try to sell you a bunch of stuff. Now, this doesn't mean what they say is not true. It just means being cautious. Another thing that's become a thing in recent years is the comedy kind of news show. The original version of this, of course, was probably The Daily Show, originally with Jon Stewart, now with Trevor Noah. Then you had The Colbert Report, and also a lot of the late night shows, also again with Stephen Colbert and others. They do a lot of, kind of political fake news, or actually real news, but comedically spun. Now that, of course, can be entertaining and actually present true stuff, but if someone's got a clear agenda, like if you have, Colbert is clearly pretty left, and so when he is presenting stuff, I mean, he typically doesn't lie about things, but it's presented in a common fashion with a clear lean. And so it's good to be, aware of that lean. Now, of course, we go to the newest thing, the internets. Now, who controls and regulates the internet and makes sure that only true things are on the web? Who is in charge? Mostly overall nobody. Now, in local areas, of course, like the Chinese control their internet pretty tightly, the Russians control theirs, and even our internet is controlled. Not so much by the government, but by the companies that own the ISP services and who own the web providers. Because to get on the internet, you of course have to have access to it. If you're going to put stuff up, you typically need like some kind of service, like maybe like WordPress or a hosting thing. But overall, it's kind of the wildest of west. No one's really in charge. And this, of course, includes things like Facebook and Google. They kind of do their stuff. And, you know, the Europeans have done some things to rein them in, and Congress is still trying to figure out, you know, how to print out Facebook, and, you know, how it works. But currently, again, it's pretty wild west. So that means that all the stuff we've learned so far about being suspicious of things applies like to the internet, but probably 10 times as much, because there is no control. Another thing that can occur, of course, in the internet is it's pretty hard to print like a fake newspaper that looks like a perfectly real newspaper and distribute it widely. It may be done, but it's pretty expensive. Likewise, it's pretty hard to fake a TV station and broadcast it. But it's really easy to fake, you know, web pages. And there are sites that try to, you know, duplicate news sites and redirect people to them. So the internet makes that, you know, faking easy. Because anybody, you have one person just making up all kinds of fake stuff, and if they got some skill, they can make it look as good as the New York Times. They put all that stuff in there. So the general takeaway is, should be super suspicious of the internet, but of course it doesn't mean we should doubt everything, because the internet is not like a magical place. It's simply a new way of presenting information. So all the old standards apply. You'd still look at it and say, okay, does this match my observations? Does this match my background information? And is the source credible? But again, the internet adds the extra kind of challenge of finding the source, because so much is anonymous, and of course people can fake sources. They can make it seem like it's ABC News, but it's ABC News with like two S's or something. Looks real, but not real. Wikipedia. Wikipedia, of course, everyone's been there, super useful. Now, in general, when it comes to, you know, sort of neutral, factual stuff, pretty accurate. Most of the wikis, the established wikis are. But of course, what makes a wiki is what? Well, in theory, who can go and put in information and change it?
Anybody.
Yeah, anybody. Which means, I mean, there are people who are pretty dedicated to keeping it accurate, but of course, as you know, people go in and just change stuff. And so at any given moment, you may not know completely for sure if it's 100% accurate. Now, some people say, you know, don't use it, but it's very useful and accurate in many cases. But the thing to do, if you're kind of suspicious, or even if you're not, it's good to confirm with a couple other sources that don't like refer back to Wikipedia. Blogs. Now, what are the licensure requirements to be a blogger? How many tests do you have to take to get that blogging license? Yeah, 0. There is no blogging license. All you got to be able to do is operate a keyboard and have access to it. And one good thing about the internet is anybody who can get access, which is anybody who can go to like a Starbucks or a library, anybody who can get, you know, words, they can have a blog. There are plenty of free services like WordPress, which is a open source program, but also a site you can put your blogs on, Blogger, and there are other ones you can pay for. So literally anyone can have a blog, and probably everyone has at one point or another. But of course there's no licensing and no policing, except by whoever happens to control that blog. Now, as you might imagine, some blogs are very credible and good. So if you go, for example, to the Scientific American blog, or if you go to a blog operated by, you know, a credible organization or a credible writer, it can be high quality, really good stuff, as good as anything from the New York Times or other sources. Or it could be stuff that's just made up and intentionally deceitful. Again, because when it's on the internet, no one's in charge. With this both good, because never before in human history has there been such freedom to express oneself. Any one of us can go onto YouTube and create our own channel, which is amazingly powerful. We can go onto, blogging sites, create our own blogs. Literally, any one of us could become the next multimedia sensation. Not me, for sure, not me, definitely not. But one of you can do this. And people have done this. They become, super famous on YouTubes and put out a lot of good stuff. But of course, there's a lot of crap out there that's, deceitful and hateful. But again, even though the technology is relatively newish, the ancient ways of assessing it hasn't changed. So when you get stuff, you'd always want to, again, go through your checklist. Does this match my observations? Does this match my background information? And what is the source? Is it credible? If it doesn't pass those tests, it doesn't mean it's not true, but it means you should probably at least suspend judgment. And as a general rule, the more you want it to be true, the more cautious you should be. Because things we want to be true, we tend to be less critical about. So if you feel like, yeah, this is just what I wanted to see, this is too good to be, true, it might well be. Or maybe it is totally true. Especially with the 2020 election coming up, because we know the Russians are going to be doing as much as they can to do their thing again. And they're pretty good at it. So, pays to be on guard. And of course, there's always people trying to tell you, crap. So, always good to be cautious. Before pressing on, anything about the terrible lies of the internet that needs more stuff? Speaking of terrible lies, advertising. Now, advertising has been around a really long time. In fact, we think there's some evidence that the ruined city of Pompeii, they actually had advertisements on the wall. So people are trying to, the walls they found. So people are trying to sell people crap forever, since people invented, selling stuff. Now, today, even more so than ever, advertising is a huge thing. When I was younger, of course, it was on the TV, the newspapers, the radios, and now it's, all through Facebook, through Twitter, probably Instagram probably has ads in it now. Everything's got ads. Although, of course, now you can pay to avoid ads, which is, I guess, most people prefer to, which makes sense. So, why is it important to know about advertising? Well, here's the idea. Somewhat jokingly, the whole point of advertising is to neutralize your intelligence so they can take your money, which is kind of true. Now, there are always and often really terrible ads, but overall, the most money is spent on advertising. So like if you see a TV show, per second, the ads you see, more money was put into that than the show, most likely. Although if you look at the local ads where someone's got a camcorder, they're trying to sell you cars and stuff, probably not a lot of money. But they have people who are experts in psychology and marketing, etc., and they try to make these things perfectly calculated to make us want crap we don't need. Now sometimes they fail terribly and hilariously, but sometimes they succeed. Now people often think that ads don't work and don't affect them, but to believe that, we'd have to believe that all these companies for all these years have just been totally stupid, that they're just literally putting money in a pile and burning it, which could be true. Maybe the ad companies are only deceiving the people that are paying them to make the ads. But they do seem to be effective, be they political or commercial. So how should you handle ads? Well, probably the best thing to do is just ignore them. To have like Chrome and other web browsers have ad blockers, or just skip ad in YouTube, or if you got the money, paying for ads. But when you encounter them, there's basically two questions to ask if you want to approach them rationally. One is, does this ad give you a good reason to buy the product? Now this product could be traditional products like books, insurance, Gatorade, anything that we sell. And it could also be ideas. It could be politicians. Again, we have the 2020 election coming up, and all the politicians are basically saying, buy me, in a way, literally. And so when we're looking at those ads, we can look at them the same way. So when Kamala Harris gets up there and says, Medicare for all, I guess you walk that back a bit, does her saying that give you a reason to buy? And of course, Trump will be running, and I guess he'll be saying MAGA again, although he's already in charge, so make America greater, I don't know what he's gonna say. But basically he's doing a commercial for buy Trump. And so you have to say, does this ad give me a good reason? So, what's a good reason to buy something? Well, that's a matter of values, and everyone probably has different answers, but kind of a rational, sensible answer is this. It makes sense to buy something when you'd be better off with that product than without it. Taking into consideration also that you'd be better off with a product than with something else, or with not spending your money at all, just keeping it and like investing it or just not spending it. And so the rational choice is pretty straightforward. To ask yourself, okay, would I be better off with this or not? Now the whole point of commercials is to make it hard to answer this question. Namely, do you always know when you'll be better off with a product? And the answer is, in large part, no. Because one of the points of advertising is often to make us feel that we would be way better off, or to create in us a feeling, a lack, that we didn't know we had. So to create needs we didn't know we had before, as people say, something I can't live without that I just found out about, a minute ago. And so much of the advertising is designed to create insecurities and fears in us that the product will save us from, or to make us feel that we just need it, that things will be so much better. So the critical approach is to ask yourself that question, will I be better off, followed by, but really, is it something I really need to get? Because it's designed to make things look super cool and to make people want it. So what's the answer? Well, there are many types of ads generally. We've all seen them, there's like humorous ads, there's like, ads that are pull at our heartstrings, typically featuring like dogs and children, and there are ads that are scary, like the security, system ads, and so there's all kinds of different approaches. Then there's like the artsy ad, you're like, I don't know what they're selling, there's all this stuff happening, you're like, what's going on? But overall, you can smush these into two broad categories. Category one, ads that actually do give us reasons. So they try to offer a reason to get their product. And there are ads that do that. They'll, for example, a trading company might say, we offer lower trading costs and we generally get a higher return on investment, which would be reasons, use our service, it costs you less, you make more money. Or a sports beverage might say, their reasons might be that, stay in the game longer, which amounts to, it gives you more energy and nutrients. And so many ads do give us reasons. It's usually dressed up, with rhetoric and so forth, but they'll often advance reasons, buy the product because. Now the second type are those that don't give us any reasons, not even a product. Now, there are many ads like this. For example, like the ones that said, like the ones that, pull on people's heartstrings, like they're Budweiser, I think it was Budweiser, they had the one with the horse, it was like the Super Bowl some years back, and they showed the story of this horse. Nothing to do with beer, except, it's a Budweiser horse, and you really feel for that horse. Or they had like a dog, sort of a dog, or the kid, like the Darth Vader kid. And of course people feel that, or they also have ones that are, hilarious. There's one, it had like G.I. Joe and Barbie selling Nissan cars. Hilarious ad, still funny to this day. But I never bought a Nissan because of it, but it's still pretty funny. Yeah, and some ads can be hilarious and classics. But of course, does seeing the touching story of a horse and its beer, poor horse became an alcoholic, that's the sad part that I'll tell you about. Does that give you a reason to buy the product? No. I mean, a commercial could be hilarious, the greatest, funniest commercial ever, but still, saying, aha, that's pretty funny, so I must buy this car, doesn't follow. Or like the Corona ads, they're pretty clever. They show someone, on a beach, and then it basically says, if you drink enough, you'll hallucinate. I guess that's the that's the pitch, but not really reasons. Some try to appeal to and do like Gillette recently had a controversial ad where they basically said, guys, stop being terrible, which is good advice. I mean, that part's good advice. But does that prove you should buy Gillette razors? No, it has nothing to do really with razors. I mean, the basic moral idea is a good one. Don't be awful. That's good. But don't be awful, buy razors. Well, doesn't follow. But the idea, of course, is if you want to be cynical, why would Gillette do an ad like that? Looked at cynically. Well, the idea is like, look how enlightened we are. We're social justice warriors too. We want to be a social justice warrior, shave with our razors. But of course, virtue posturing isn't reasons to buy the stuff. I mean, the ethics of the ad stand or fall on its own. If you analyze the ad and say, yes, this is bad behavior, you shouldn't do that, that's one thing, but it doesn't give you any logical reason to buy their products. Likewise, when Pepsi did the famous thing when they had the person, giving the police officer the Pepsi and solving all the problems with Pepsi, I basically just trying to use virtue signaling to say, hey, we're cool and progressive too, buy our soda. And that sometimes it can backfire. Like in that case, people are like, yeah, that's just exploiting social causes to make money. But of course, those don't give us any reasons. The ad may be touching, cute, humorous, enlightened, but it doesn't give you a logical reason to buy a razor, a Pepsi, or whatever they're selling. So ads that don't give you reasons, obviously don't give you reasons. You're looking at it, you can't say, aha, that ad gave me a reason that this will make my life better, because it doesn't. It just says, wow, they spent a lot of money, on this ad, presenting, a moral stance, hoping people will buy more razors and shaving cream. Now, what about ones that do offer reasons? Well, again, those are ones that, to some degree, say things like, we charge less, for transactions, we have a higher return, or our beverage has got like lots of nutrients in it, and those do give you some reasons. And so in the techie fields, like if ads for like video cards, computers, they of course put the stats in there, like it's got an i7 processor, or it's like got 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and so you can actually see data in there. But the ones that offer us reasons, here's the problem. Going back to the idea of bias, the whole point of an ad is to do what?
Sell something.
Yeah, to sell to you. So they have an interest. They want they're not putting the ad out there to amuse you and make you feel better or make moral statements. Their objective is to sell more, whatever, video cards, shaving cream, razors, insurance, or whatever. So one major factor is, of course, they're biased. And ads tend to be ambiguous and vague and inexact because technically they're not supposed to be able to lie, but of course they use pretty vague phrases like get you back in the game. What does it mean? It implies like maybe it gives you more nutrients or something, but it really amounts to nothing. So one main factor is, again, they're always an interested party because they're trying to sell you stuff. The ads tend to be vague, they tend to be ambiguous, and generally the reasons they give are ones you tend to be skeptical about. Again, they're not supposed to be able to lie outright, although they sometimes do. You can occasionally hear about class action lawsuits against companies. Like, for example, they're still around, occasionally I see them. They have the running shoes with the 5, like gloves, kind of like gloves for your feet. And the company made the mistake of claiming that they had actual health benefits. They should have said, hey, they're gloves you wear on your feet. Isn't that cool? Your friends totally won't make fun of you for wearing those. But they made these apparently health claims and they were sued. And they, of course, couldn't back them up because wearing gloves on your feet doesn't really do that. And so they got in a fair amount of trouble. Similarly, I think it's Gwyneth Paltrow, one of those celebrities. She has a website where she's selling like crystals and stuff with medical claims. And the FDA is like, yeah, you can't say that crystals do that stuff. And you get in some trouble. So sometimes they do outright like lie, say untrue things. Kind of one area that's kind of fuzzy is the health region. In the US, if you have a medical thing, like a drug, you have to everyone's seen the ads, they'll say, they'll have like a ton of all these terrifying side effects like death, double death, triple death, more death, reanimation as a zombie, then death. And they have to do that because, they can't, because of the strict rules governing pharmaceuticals. But if you're doing like a herbal supplement, that's a food, not like a medicine, you can claim all kinds of stuff, as long as you don't claim it cures a particular disease, which is why if you look on products that say like promotes brain health, or promotes liver function, they'll typically have a little disclaimer saying none of this has been proven or tested, essentially. And so in those cases, again, they can't outright lie, but they can say things that are kind of not true. It's especially good to be wary of things like in the supplement business. There's really very little regulation, and some of the stuff they find is actually harmful. It's not like instant death, but it's bad for you. And people often say, well, it's all natural, but as I point out to people, there's nothing more natural than a rattlesnake, but you don't want one of those things biting you. Cyanide, also supernatural, found in nature. Uranium, plutonium, totally natural, but you don't want any of that stuff. At least not in your food. You wouldn't want a big bowl of uranium flakes in the morning. So the ads provide reasons, in a way, give us no reason. We shouldn't trust them. Now, even if they were somehow completely honest and completely accurate, we really have no way of knowing, because it's such a sketchy field that in a way the sketchiness affects everybody. You have no way of knowing that a particular ad is like, these are the one honest ad. You don't know. Now, there is one kind of exception to this. If you already have excellent reasons to want something, and the ad shows you that thing you've got good reasons to get exists, then that ad can give you the last reason. It could be, I need this, this, and this. If only it existed. It does exist, then you get it. For example, to use an ancient example, I remember years ago, I used to have to, well, you probably heard old people talking about this, back when you had to use floppy disks to transfer data on computers. And so I used to keep floppy disks, and of course those things suck because they'd always fail, they fail pretty regularly, etc. And they're big, well, not super huge, but this big. And I thought, wouldn't it be good if you could have something small that you could just plug in your computer and put on your keychain and carry all kinds of stuff. And then I found out about IBM made, I think, the first of the USB things. It was first one was 8 megabytes. I'll give you guys megabytes, but still pretty good. And as soon as I found out about it, I was like, I'm buying that. And it was great, because 8 megabytes, one little thing. I still have it in my office, okay, if I take it out, I think of those old days, my early days of 8 megabytes. And yeah, so sometimes you really want something, you're like, you see that it exists, and that's good enough. That's the one kind of unusual exception. So the overall takeaway is basically, as you might imagine, ads that don't give you reasons, give you no reasons. Ads that give you reasons or still don't. And so the best thing to do is don't be swayed by ads. Probably the smartest thing to do is, what most people probably do anyways, is if you're on YouTube, hit skip if you can, or just tap your headphones and just don't listen to it. Or if you have the money, just get the services that have no ads. Although it's kind of a social contract. It's kind of the deal used to be, we would watch their ads and they would give us stuff to watch, which is a fair trade. That's what it used to be. Now they say give us some money, you don't have to watch the ads, which also can be a fair trade. So the gist of it is the usual: don't trust ads. Now the political season comes up. This is even more true, because in political ads, since it's expressing ideas, the thing about truth doesn't really apply that much. So they can make claims that are, we don't know if they're true or not, but they could be just kind of making stuff up. And of course we know that politicians, they're mostly trying to sell themselves, so political ads are even worse than ads for other products. Generally, kind of the best advice would be just don't look at them and get information from more credible sources, because the politician making the ad, or anybody supporting them, is completely biased, and they're gonna say whatever it takes they think to get elected. And the people, the attack ads against them are the people who don't want them elected, so they're gonna say whatever, even untrue things, to not get them elected. So the ads are effectively, you know, sometimes they can be entertaining, see how far people will go, but probably the best advice would be just don't even look at them, because nothing good can come with that. Plus you'll sleep better, not looking at them. Now this is not to say don't be informed, but the ads don't give you useful information, because it's all biased. So that brings us to the end of chapter 4, and also part 1. So what's the important stuff in part 4? Well, kind of the heart, soul, and spirit of part 4 is this credibility. And so, as I've repeated multiple times, if you get a claim that matters, you know, it's being true or false is important, then you want to run against your own observations, your own background information, and check the sources. The more plausible a claim is, the more sensible it is to accept it. The more, you know, extraordinary, the less plausible a claim is, the more proof you would need to accept that. Now, it may turn out that something that seems initially sensible may turn out to be false, because there are many things that we've heard that are been told to us over and over that are true, but turns out they're not. For example, the myth of hydration. Everyone needs water, but we don't need as much water in hydration as they claim. Because even though our background information kind of tells us, yes, you've got to hydrate a lot, and I noticed over the years, it used to be you never saw anybody bring anything to drink. And then everyone's seen this now, people walk around with like half-gallon bottles to hydrate. And the reason for that is companies started pushing that idea to get you to buy more stuff to drink. Yeah, you do need hydration, but not as much as you might think. And the experts in nutrition say, drink when you're thirsty, which is pretty sensible. Whereas, you know, companies say, drink all the time. So there may be things that seem plausible that turn out not to be true because we've heard them so much. Another example would be, everyone's heard of the McDonald's hot coffee case?
Yeah, when the woman split hot coffee on her lap.
Yeah, and most people think, you know, that's terrible that people would just be so frivolous and sue companies for spilling coffee. Until you know the real facts of it. The real facts of it was she was sitting in the car, and she did say she had spilled it herself, but the coffee was 190 degrees. And so it spilled on her and gave her 3rd-degree burns and almost killed her.
Yeah, you had to get skin grafts.
Yeah, skin grafts, etc. So the way the story is presented is, oh, this terrible person trying to rip off companies and steal money from them. The reality was she almost was killed. And she initially just wanted McDonald's to pay for the surgery. But by the time it got sort of, you know, massaged around and twisted, now the story is typically seen as, oh, all these people trying to rip off companies with stupid things. And so things that are in our background information, we may think they're true, but they may not be true at all. And so we should always be careful, because things that seem plausible may not be. Like if you ask people about many things in politics, like you know, what is their chance of being killed by a terrorist, or how many criminals, felons come across the board, people would be wildly off about a lot of stuff. So, in general, these are good tests, but we should always be cautious, knowing that our background information could be off. Also critical to this is the idea of, you know, interested versus disinterested sources. Kind of a good guiding point with anything is you ask yourself, is the source neutral or objective, or do they have something to gain? Now, if they have something to gain, it doesn't mean they're lying. They could be telling you the truth, but it gives you grounds for being suspicious. Also, just because the source is neutral doesn't mean they're right. They could still be neutral, but wrong. So how do we tell when we're dealing with experts? Well, as we saw, you'd want to check, if it does matter enough, their education, experience, accomplishments, reputation, and position to establish their credibility. Now, also again, there's always a kind of a warning. A person could check these boxes, but may not be getting it right, because people can always get things wrong, or there may be some deceit or something going on in there. But in general, if someone's got the qualifications, what they say in their field is probably true. But again, you always want to consider that critical factor of bias and interest. Because as we've seen throughout history, you can have people who are, say, credible scientists or doctors who are getting paid. So one thing that brought about our opioid epidemic was pharmaceutical companies went to doctors and said, hey, we'll give you all these gifts, you can go to these, lunches and events and stuff, and they'll pay you to give these talks. Oh, by the way, we have all these cool opioids. Maybe you should tell your patients they need lots of opioids. And so even though they had, plenty of credibility, they had a clear bias. And one concern, of course, in medicine is that connection between pharmaceutical companies and medicine. So a fair point is, if you're prescribed like this medicine or these opioids, do you really need them, or does your doctor just need to make payments on their drug? Now, most doctors are probably honest, but it is a point of concern. Again, that interest factor, pretty critical factor. Now, we also saw with experts, if they're talking in the area, great, but people tend to get outside of their role. Now, that need not be bad. People obviously have the right to free expression, and smart people can say smart things outside of their field. But if someone's talking outside of their field, you still should prefer what experts say, even if those experts are less famous than the person talking in that field. And I gave the example of how Elon Musk says AI is going to kill us all. I mean, he's right. He's totally right. 2024, Google kills us all. But of course, that's not his expertise. He's a pretty smart guy, but maybe he's building the AI. Maybe that's how he knows. It's all planned out. He's mad about, something. People are not buying enough cars. So buy more cars, people, so Elon Musk doesn't kill us. And similarly, Stephen Hawkins talking about AI is going to kill us all. Again, smart guy in physics, but that's not his field. So I would listen to a less famous or non-famous expert in AI over Stephen Hawkins or Elon Musk, because true, they're smart guys. Well, one of them's dead now, but it's not their expertise. Again, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but the expert talking in the field is more credible than a non-expert who's famous talking outside of their field. Then, of course, we get to what we're talking about today, and the idea, of course, is always be cautious. If it's important, always be cautious. Especially, again, in this age of fake news and intentional disinformation campaigns. Okay, so that takes us to the end of part 1. Before going to the start of part 2, see your full money's worth, anything about part 1 that needs more part 1-ing? Okay, perfect knowledge. Excellent. Okay, now we head into part 2. Dun, dun, dun. Now, we jump ahead to chapter 5, because, as I mentioned, the way they used to be organized, they kind of moved the chapters around to come up with new editions, so people would buy the new edition, because it's how textbooks work. So now we head to chapter 5. Now, part 2 is all about rhetoric and fallacies. And as I mentioned before, if you want to persuade people, to sway the masses, the worst thing you can do is use logic. And the second worst thing you can do is probably to use the truth. Because truth doesn't matter, logic doesn't matter. So if you want to sway people, what's very useful is complete lack of argumentation, basically rhetoric. What's even more effective than no logic is terrible logic. So if you want to persuade people, really bad logic is probably the best tool to use. It's incredibly effective. And if you don't want to persuade people, then good argumentation is the way to do it. People are more likely to not believe you if you use a good argument than if you use a terrible, terrible argument, which is horrifying, but makes me sad every day. But here we go. Now we'll look at this both from the standpoint of good and evil. From the standpoint of good, we'll look at recognizing rhetoric, how to neutralize it, so you can, and also fallacies, so you can pierce through the emptiness, through the bad logic. So that way you can avoid being manipulated yourself. It's kind of like getting a vaccine against, the infection, so you get protection against it. Then, of course, look at the side of evil, which is how these things can be used to manipulate people and deceive them, sort of in terms of like a toolbox or weapon arsenal. How do you weaponize this stuff to make people believe stuff they probably shouldn't believe? So look at it from both standpoints. So our mission objectives in Chapter 5 are these. We're going to look at rhetoric versus argument. And kind of the core difference between Part 2 and then Part 3 and 4 is Part 2 is all about bad logic and no logic, and how to defend against it and how to use it. And Part 3 and 4 is all about good logic and how to use it. Now, as a practical matter, if you want to persuade people, no logic, bad logic works great. If you want to make good choices, don't do that, use the good logic. So a very clever evil person would learn all the logics because they would make all their own choices using good logic and then sway people with rhetoric and bad logic. And if someone gets bad logic, like in the decision process, they make a lot of bad choices. Now we'll also look at, in this chapter, our main focus will be rhetorical devices. We can think of them as tools or weapons with very particular purposes. So we'll learn to recognize what they are, how to diffuse them, and how to deploy them. And these will include uses that are neutral, because I don't want to create the, maybe I've already done this, but I don't want to create the impression that rhetoric is inherently evil. As I mentioned before, there's no sense in presenting your views, if you're using good logic, and making it intentionally non-appealing, by making it boring. And so rhetoric is neutral, as we'll see. And so you'll probably want to make things look good, so we'll look at using rhetoric in a way that's not evil, I suppose. But we'll also look at how to use it evilly. So what are the devices that you'll be adding to your toolkit if you don't already have them already? Well, they'll include euphemisms, making things look better, dismissums, making things look worse, the weaseler, trying to defend things in a weird way, the downplayer, which is super useful if you're going to politics and damage control. Then we'll look at stereotypes, innuendo, loaded questions, as opposed to leading questions. Then we'll look at ridicule, sarcasm, and hyperbole, very useful tools. And then rhetorical definitions, explanations, analogies, and of course misleading comparisons. And then wrapping up with proof surrogates and repetition, and repetition, and repetition. And then lastly, we'll look at the rhetorical tools, look at the use of visual images, both moving and still. Now the objective of rhetoric, and fallacies to a degree, is to influence and sway others. Now people often ask me, how do I win an argument? Like I find out, like if I do, because I do like obviously critical thinking stuff and argument stuff, and people say, how do I win an argument? And of course I'll ask them, what do you mean by win? What are the victory conditions? And if they say truth, then I say, well, logic. That's how you win. You present hopefully true premises using good logic, you get a conclusion that's well supported, and if you get to the truth, you win. And they say, if they say, I want to score points against other people and make other people believe me and show people to be fools on the internet. And I'll say, okay, winning by that you just mean you don't want to get to truth, you just want to score points and persuade people, get people to believe whether it's true or not. Now rhetoric, kind of its primary function is getting people to believe whether it's true or not. Logic is aimed at proving something is true regardless of what people think or feel about it. The main function of rhetoric, though, is getting people to feel a certain way so they believe a certain way, whether it's true or false. Now, again, I don't want to cast rhetoric as like essentially evil, because if you're presenting a good argument, it would be foolish to make it like terrible rhetorically. Again, go back to the analogy. The logic or logical force is like the nutritional value of food. That's something objective, and the idea is that that is what you seek in food as nutrients. Now, logical force, to be more specific and move away from the food analogy, is how well the premises support the conclusion. That's a matter of logic. And when we get into the next part, part 3, we'll look at inductive arguments being strong or weak, and then in part 4, deductive arguments being valid or invalid. Rhetorical force has nothing to do with logical force. Rhetorical force is, to use my food analogy, that's like the tastiness of a food. And you can't tell how nutritional a food is by how tasty it is. And we know from experience that most things that taste really good often are not very nutritional. And things that often taste really, not so great are very nutritional. And for example, like broccoli. Most people don't find broccoli delicious, but it's very nutritional. People tend to like, cupcakes, pies, donuts, etc., but they're not super nutritious. So rhetoric is like the flavoring. So rhetorical force, moving away from the food metaphor, is how much of an emotional impact it has. How much of it pushes our feelings negative or positive. And again, going back to the metaphor, this is like nutritional value, objective and what we're looking for in food as food. And this is like the flavor, which is subjective, whether it tastes, whether it's got, 5 grams of iron or not is objective. It's got 5 grams of iron for you, 5 grams of iron for me. Although we may absorb it differently, that's how much is in it. It's an objective matter. But the tastiness of something, whether something is tasty or yucky, that's all in the person. It's how, if you ask people like, what is the best ice cream? People tend to have very different answers because everything tastes different to everybody. So rhetoric is kind of like that. The rhetorical flavor varies from person to person, which is why, as I go through this, I'll note, just like if you're making a meal specifically for someone, you'd want to know what they like and dislike. So it may be a delicious meal for one person, may be horrible for another. Or another example, think of like spiciness. Some people really like super hot food. Other people, they think ketchup is an exotic spice. Just ketchup, please. And so you'd want to know your audience. Likewise with rhetoric. Depending on what you pick, to one person it may be delicious, to another it may be horrible. And a critical part of rhetoric is knowing your audience. Now logic, you don't need to know a thing about your audience, because your audience doesn't matter. All that matters is the quality of the argument. An argument is not valid for one person and not valid for another, it's just valid or invalid. Rhetoric, though, again, is like the flavor of food. It's delicious for one, terrible for another. So this is kind of like learning like nutrition, and this is like learning, spicing and, presentation. Now, the first set of our tools will be the rhetorical devices. And these are things that are good to have in your toolkit in 2 ways. One is, think of them as tools or weapons. The more options you have, you can break them out when you need them. And each one is a particular function. Like if you need to do this, you break out your, say euphemism to euphemize something. You can use an analogy to a toolbox. Like if you need to, drive in a nail, you take out the hammer. You don't take out the saw. Or think of like, to use a modern analogy, you can think of your phone. If you're going to take pictures, you use your camera app. You don't use like your Google Maps app. And think of these as apps, tools, or weapons, whatever metaphor you'd like. And so we'll look at them in terms of what they do, how to defend against them, how to use them. Our first one is the euphemism. Now, what a euphemism does is this. To use a metaphor, it takes things that are neutral or bad tasting and makes them taste good. It's like in the Mary Poppins movie, both the original and the remake, it's the spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down type of deal. It's like sprinkling sugar on it. So it makes the distasteful or neutral taste better, so you swallow it. So its function is this. When do you use euphemism? Well, what is it and what do you do with it? Well, laying aside the metaphor, what it does is this. you take something, a term that is neutral or negative, that it has what's called a connotation. The connotation for a term is how it makes you feel, positive or negative. The denotation of a term is what it refers to. And you can have words of the same denotation, but different connotations, positive or negative. Now what a euphemism does is takes a term with a negative or neutral feel and substitutes in a word that means the same thing, but has a positive feel to it. So its function is this. You have something neutral or negative, you want to make it seem less bad or good. So what you do is you swap out that neutral or negative term, and then you put in something tastier, something with a positive feel to it. Now, of course, you need to know your audience, because just like with food, people have very different sort of rhetorical tastes. So if someone's speaking to white nationalists, their euphemisms are need to be different than someone speaking to, say, liberal Democrats. Or if someone's speaking to atheists, they would use different rhetoric than speaking to devout, believers. And so you need to know your audience, because one person's positive can be a terrifying negative to another person. So, what would be some examples of euphemisms? Well, again, their function is taking the neutral or negative and making it neutral. If it's negative, making it neutral, at least neutral or positive. And here are some classic examples. Now, it used to be you could buy like used cars and used clothing. But of course today you can't buy used cars and you can't buy used clothing. You can only buy what? Yeah, but what do they call them now? Do they have used car lots? Does it say like Biff's used cars? It's, Biff's, used clothing. Yeah, pre-owned, certified pre-owned, even better. Yeah, because pre-owned sounds better than used. You wouldn't want a used toothbrush or a used lollipop, but a pre-owned lollipop or a pre-owned toothbrush sounds better. Still terrible, but sounds better. Yeah, so we now use the term pre-owned for used, because it sounds better. Like with clothing now, it's not just pre-owned, it's vintage. Because that sounds even better, because vintage sounds super classy, like it's got comes with wine or something. Yeah, so now you buy vintage, gently used, pre-owned vintage clothing. Old stuff is often referred to not as old, but as classics. Because it sounds, I'm not old, I'm classical. And it sounds better. Similarly, people aren't fired anymore, they're let go or downsized. Because those are, we don't know what they mean, but being fired, pretty clear. Downside sounds less bad. People are no longer garbage men, they're sanitation engineers. They're engineering that garbage. There aren't any more secretaries, they're all office, assistants or office managers. And so we use more positive terms for things today. Politics, of course, is full of euphemisms. We say, for example, that we don't kill people, we neutralize. Or we don't have civilians that are killed like in a bombing, we have collateral damage. We don't have prisoners committing suicide, they engage in self-injurious behavior. As you might imagine, sexism and racism is often loaded with euphemisms. So, for example, before when they talk about immigration, they would talk about immigrants coming to take our jobs, and then Trump kind of just blew that up and just went straight to the people are coming here to commit crimes and full on kind of like racism. And so, different people have different euphemisms they use, but again, the idea is to make the bad look not so bad. So in terms of when you'd use this, it'd be in a scenario where you've got something bad and you want to make it look less bad. This could be done, again, in the case of when people want to do bad stuff to other people, like neutralize them or fire them, Or in cases where people want to sell like a political idea that if you put it out, as it is, like that it's racist or sexist, they generally put it forth as a euphemism because it seems less bad. So you don't talk about like, voter suppression, you talk about like, voter ID and states' rights. So you euphemize it that way. You take the negative make it appear positive. When would you use this? Well, people use it in everyday life. Instead of referring to like something, like someone who's had an affair might talk about it as their little indiscretion, as opposed to their marriage-ending affair. Or little fender bender, as opposed to like a catastrophic accident. And as I've noted, people in politics use this quite a bit. They'll want to, typically like, they're endorsing terrible things. They might be like horribly racist or sexist, and they want their base to know, hey, I'm with you with all my racism and sexism, but I don't want the other people to know. Really, there's a whole science of dog whistling and stuff where you can say stuff where it's clearly totally racist, but the words actually aren't because they're using euphemism for stuff. And everyone knows they're talking about, but they can deny. And people who are good at being evil and political know all the code phrases, all the dog whistles, all the euphemisms. Now, the way to defend against it is to swap out the positive term, not for something negative, because that would be totally biased, but swap out the neutral term. So if we're assessing like government policies, swap out, say, the euphemism for racism and put in the real term. Or if we're talking about killing people, swap out neutralize and put in kill. Or if we're talking about firing people, swap out downsize and put in fire. And so the way to neutralize euphemisms is like mentally swap out the euphemism for the real thing. And it can make a huge difference in the way something reads. Like if you take, say, a political speech packed with euphemisms, and you swap in just the neutral terms, it can change the whole feeling of the speech from something positive to something pretty negative. And people use these, of course, because words with a positive connotation make people feel good, even about stuff that's bad. So recap, euphemism is when you take something that is neutral, or more typically negative, and you swap out a term or phrase that means the same thing, but has a positive feel for it. So instead of referring to people as, say, terrorists, you might talk about them as being freedom fighters, for example. The way to use this is, again, you get something bad, you want to make it sound good, swap in a similar phrase that's more appealing. But again, you always get to know your audiences, because a euphemism that may please racists probably is not going to please everybody. Defense, simply recognize euphemism, swap in the neutral term, and then reassess. Before moving on to dismisms, anything about euphemism that needs more stuff? Oh, one last thing for euphemism. Appropriate use. Now, there are cases when euphemisms are appropriate for moral or social reasons. For example, funerals. We refer to the dead person not as the corpse or the dead person, we refer to them as what? Yeah, dearly departed, because that sounds better than corpse. And that is perfectly fine, because death is an uncomfortable thing for people, and it's much more polite to say dearly departed than corpse or carcass or stiff. Similarly, when we're talking to children about all the terrible things that adults do and all the terrible things in the world, we often use euphemisms for things. Like you don't talk to like 3-year-olds about like adultery or genocide. And so people would often use euphemisms. They say like, why is the person so sad? And look up the euphemism for what terrible things are going on. And that can be appropriate use because there's plenty of times in life to be ruined. In childhood, we want to keep that ruining down to a minimum. Yeah, so there are cases where it's perfectly fine and correct to use euphemisms. Now, the opposite of euphemism is the dysphemism. So if euphemisms make the bad look good, the opposite, of course, is to make the which is their function. So the function of dysphemism is taking something that's neutral or positive and swapping out a word or phrase that means the same thing, but has a negative feel to it. And so the objective is the opposite, to make people feel bad about something that would otherwise be neutral or even positive. Now, just like euphemisms are a common tactic in politics, so are dismisms, where they'll use negative terms for people that have negative connotations rather than like a neutral one. For example, I gave the example of how people use the term like freedom fighter as a euphemism. Now, the obvious dismism, sort of compatriot for that, would be terrorist. And depending on your viewpoint, you know, one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter. For example, back in the 1980s, the Russians made the incredibly bad mistake of invading Afghanistan, which has always been a mistake. Alexander the Great went there, and he got whooped. And if Alexander the Great can't win, probably no one can. And the Russians said, hey, I guess we can do this. So the Russians rolled in, and how'd that work out for them? Yeah, terrible. Now, one of the reasons why it didn't work out so well for them is because we were funding the locals, providing them with anti-tank weaponry, anti-aircraft weaponry, and we were funding them. And of course, when they were killing Ruskies, or Soviets back then, they were freedom fighters, because they were killing Russians. And then, of course, the Russians eventually just gave up and the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we decided, hey, let's go invade Afghanistan, because that's worked so great for everyone else. And now, the former freedom fighters who were killing Russians are now killing Americans. And they went from being freedom fighters to terrorists. Because freedom fighters are people killing people you don't like, and terrorists are people that are killing you. Same people, doing basically the same thing, killing people invading their country, but it all depends on who they're killing. So terrorist is typically a euphemism for freedom fighter. Now, politics, of course, is full of these. So, for example, well, most commonly used on the left, people call people on the right fascists. Now, it may be true that they may actually be fascists, but often people misuse it. If you have someone who's just conservative and you call them a fascist, that's a dismism for being conservative. Because not all conservatives, not even most of them are fascists. Fascism is like way off to the right. Of course, people on the right refer to people on the left as like, you know, snowflakes, social justice warriors, and those are supposed to be dismisms, supposed to be insulting people. And so dismisms are when you want to take the neutral or positive and make it look negative. The way to use it again is swap out a negative term. And again, different audiences have different negatives. So you want to put in a term that is negative. Because one person's negative, could be another person's positive. The way to defend against it is just like the euphemism, except in reverse. Take out the negative thing, and then put in the neutral term. Describe the thing as it is. Now, there are some times where if you pull out the negative term and put in the neutral term, it could still be pretty terrible, because there are many things that are neutral that are still, you know, neutral term for them is still pretty terrible. So that's the way to handle euphemisms and dismisms. Perfect time. So done, and have a good rest of the week, and I'll see you on the Tuesday.